This video today is going to be a full Django crash course, and the only prerequisite is going to be a basic understanding of the Python language. You need to know what functions are, what loops are, if statements, decorators, the basic stuff you'll learn in the first 2 or 3 weeks of learning Python. Besides that, this is going to be super beginner friendly, and we're going to cover a lot. We're going to cover basic stuff like understanding the project structure of Django applications. We're going to learn how to render HTML, how to work with various parameters like query and path parameters. We're going to create our own models and work with different databases, and we're going to explore convenient tools like Django Forms, admin features, and the Django Shell. Finally, we'll also learn how to run Django applications in production with Gunicorn and Docker. There's a lot to cover today, so if you like this video, let me know by hitting a like button and subscribing. But now, let us get right into it. Alright, so we're going to do a Django crash course in this video today, and as I already mentioned, we have a lot to cover today, which is why I'm going to prioritize speed. So we're not going to spend hours talking about a single concept. I am going to try to explain everything that's relevant in a simple way so you can understand it, but I'm going to try to cover a lot of stuff in a short amount of time, which is why we're not necessarily going to go into a lot of details on every single thing we cover. Also, one thing that you could potentially be interested in is comparing Django to Flask and Fast API. I'm not going to do that in this video today. I do have a separate video where I do that in detail. The bottom line is, the in a nutshell summary is Django comes with a lot of batteries included. It is a professional framework with a lot of stuff that's already built into it. When you create a project, you already have a structure. You have to adhere to the structure. There's a certain correct way in which things are done in Django, so you don't have the flexibility of Fast API or Flask, but it's also very convenient in a lot of different ways. That's the in a nutshell summary. So primarily useful for large-scale professional applications. So let us now get started with the installation. What we're going to do is we're going to open up a terminal and we're going to install Django onto our system. Now you can do that in the classic basic way by just saying pip or pip3 install Django. You can also create a virtual environment if you want to isolate it. So you can also say Python or python3-m venv.venv. This would create a virtual environment in a .venv directory. Then you can activate this environment and then do pip install to have it isolated from the rest of your system. Or if you're using UV, the Rust-based Python package manager, you can also say UV init and then UV add instead of pip install. Whatever you do, it's basically the same. In the end, you have Django installed and you can use it. So you don't have to use the same thing that I'm using here, but I'm going to use UV. So I'm going to say here UV init and UV add Django. So if you're using pip, what you do is you say pip install Django or pip3 install Django. Now, once we have that, we can start by creating a new project. For this, I'm going to open up the file explorer. I'm going to click here on new folder and I'm going to name this tutorial project, for example. So when you want to start a Django project, you do that with a command line utility called Django admin. So you don't just create all the directories yourself. You run a command called Django-admin start project. And in this command here, you specify two things, at least if you use it the way we're going to use it. One is the name of the main module. I'm going to call it core in my case. This is going to contain the application settings, the main URL routing, so which paths in the URL lead to which components of the application. There's going to be your main config, so to say. So you can call this core, you can call this main, config, whatever you want. I'm just going to call it core. And the second parameter here is going to be the directory of our project. So in my case, tutorial project. Now, since I'm using UV, if you're not using UV, you can just run this command. Since I'm using UV, I have to say UV run to make this possible because I installed Django inside of this UV virtual environment. So I need to also say UV run Django admin for this to work. In your case, again, if you're not using UV, just Django admin, start project, core, tutorial project. Same effect, nothing different. And if we now open up the Explorer, we're going to see that this tutorial project directory was populated with a managed py file and with a core directory that contains a bunch of Python files. Now, I don't want to bore you with too much theory here before we start coding, so I'm just going to briefly cover the most important parts. Managed py, you don't really care about what's written in this file. Let me zoom out a little bit here. You don't really care about the contents of this file. This is more like a utility that we use for database migrations. I'm going to explain what that is later on in the video. We use it to run the server. We use it to play around with the shell. This is just a Python script that we use. We don't really care about what's inside of it. Now for these here, these two are basically irrelevant. These are just some things for running asynchronous or synchronous servers. You can ignore them. The important files in this core module here are settings and URLs. URLs basically just contains the URL mappings. So if we have a domain, let's say we're running our Django application somewhere on mywebsite.com, then I have /admin, for example. This is a default route. This basically means that when I go to /admin/something, I'm using these sub URLs of admin. Later on, we're going to create applications inside of our Django project, and then we're going to have different URLs there. For example, I could have a URL category or an application called to-dos, and inside of that to-dos, I have something like create to-do, where I have something like, let me zoom in a little bit so you can read this, create to-do, or something like details / and then to-do IDs, like 10, for example, or 20, whatever. I have certain paths that lead to certain functionality in my application, and this is defined here and then later on in submodules, in sub URLs files of other applications. That's what this file is for. We're gonna come back to it when we need it. The other very important file is settings.py. I don't think that there's a lot of value in going through everything that's written in here, but what you need to understand is that this is your main configuration. Whenever you want to change something fundamental about your application, you're going to do it here probably. So this is, for example, the secret key, which is useful for signing stuff if you need that later on in your application. You also set the debug mode to true or false here. You also manage the database connection here. By default, we're just using a SQLite database. This is just a simple database that is stored in a single file. You can also change the config here to connect, for example, to MySQL or Postgres. Other stuff like the static directory is also managed here. So where do you have your CSS, JavaScript, and so on? You can also manage the time zone. This is just the main config file of your application. I'm sure we're going to need it in this video today, but for now, we're just going to accept that the settings.py file is an essential file where we configure stuff. So now that we know that, let us create our first actual application. You don't want to have your functionality in this core module here. You want to create a new app inside of the project for a specific use case. So what you usually do, this is a best practice, you want to keep your project modular. So what you do is you create a separate app for each use case. So you could have one app for authentication, one app for managing to-dos, one app for managing bookings, and so on. You have different apps for different purposes. And how do we create an app? We do that in the command line with a Django admin or with a manage py script. So I think both works. We can do again Django admin start app. And for this, we should go inside of our directory first. So we go inside of tutorial project. And here we say Django admin start app this time. So not start project. We are starting an app inside of the project. And we're going to call this, for example, to-dos. Now, in my case, again, UV run, but basically you can just run the command if you're not using UV. And this now creates more files. Now we have a directory called to-dos, and in this directory, we have a bunch of files as well. We have admin, apps, models, tests, and views. Now, again, I'm not going to talk about this too much in theory before we actually need it. I think you will best learn it when we use the files once we need them. But a high-level explanation here is admin is for registering stuff with the built-in Django admin interface. We're going to talk about this later in the video, so I'm not going to go deeper on that yet. Apps is just a basic config file for this application, for this to-dos app component. Models is for defining database models. Whenever we want to work with something that is in the database, we need to map it to a Python object. This is what we define here in the models.py. Also something that we'll cover later in the video. Tests is for writing tests. We're not going to write any tests in this crash course, so we're going to ignore this one. And views is probably the most essential one. This is for returning stuff, for defining endpoints, for rendering stuff. Basically, if I have, for example, some endpoint on my website, if I have, again, mysite.com/to-dos, and then maybe list to-dos or something like this, and there I see all my to-dos, this functionality of seeing all my to-dos on this page, or the functionality of handling the creation of a new to-do, is going to be happening here via the views. In other frameworks, you could consider this to be something like a route or endpoints or whatever you want to call it. So let's not talk too much about what could be in here. Let's create a simple view so you understand how this works. Let's go and say we have a function, and this function is going to be called hello world. And what I want from this function now is to return to the user that targets this endpoint, this function, I want to return just a string hello world. So if you go to a specific location in my website, I want you to see hello world. This is what we're going to implement here. This is a so-called view. Now, every view takes in a request. This is a parameter that is just automatically there. And here, this hello world view, let's maybe call it also hello world view, not just hello world. it's going to take in an HTTP request and it's going to return an HTTP response. So the most basic way in which we can do that is we can just return an HTTP response with the raw text hello world. For that, I need to import from Django.http HTTP response. Then I can say all my function does is it returns an instance of this HTTP response that says hello world. That would already be the implementation of a view. So what this means again is we have some website, mysite.com, and there's some endpoint, maybe it's just slash, so just mysite.com and that's it, or it's /hello, for example. And if the user sends a GET request to this endpoint, GET request basically means the basic request that you have on the internet to get something, to get a resource from the website. What it's going to get, or what the user is going to get, is a string called hello world. But this alone here, just defining a function like this, is not enough to make this possible. What we need to do now is we need to say that this view belongs to a certain path, and then we need to add this path to urls.py, this file that we had up here in core. And this file, actually what it's going to do is it's going to import the URLs from the to-dos application. So what we're actually going to do to make this reachable is we're going to create a URLs file in this to-do app, and then we're going to map it, or we're going to link to it in the core module. Again, might sound more complicated than it actually is. All we have to do is we have to create a file here called urls.py, same as up here, just that we define it in to-dos. And here now, all we're going to do is we're going to say from django.urls import path, and then we're going to define URL patterns to be equal to a list, and this list will contain our path. So I'm going to say here the path, let's say our path is going to be hello. This should point to our view. Now, in order to use our view, I need to import it as well. So I'm going to say here, from current directory, from this package that I'm in, from this application, import views. And then I can say that here I want to have views.helloworld view. And I can then also give it a name. Let's call it hello world view, or let's just call it hello world. So right now, this means that this URL pattern exists inside of this application. So inside of this application, the path hello leads to the hello world view. Now I need to also say that the URLs of to-dos are imported into the application URLs. So how do I do that? I go into this file and I create a new path here. But before that, I also need to import something else, which is include. Include basically allows me to include the URLs of another app. So what I can do now is I can say that the default route, so nothing, just mysite.com, and that's it, that this includes, or this leads to all the URLs of the to-dos application. So I can just say include todos.urls. This now basically means that if I have my URL, mysite.com, everything /something is going to lead to to-dos URLs. So since in to-dos URLs I have hello as a path, it means that mysite.com /hello will lead to our hello world view. If I were to say something else here now, like to-dos, that would mean that I would have to go to mysite.com /todos/hello. So we're basically just stacking or concatenating the URL paths. But we're going to keep it as just the base path. We're going to also remove the comment here. And one more thing that we need to do is we need to register our to-dos app in our settings.py file. So I created the to-dos app, but it's not yet included into our project, into our application. So we're going to go to settings here. We're going to scroll down to installed apps. And here we're going to add the string to-dos. Now, I understand that all of this might be a bit confusing because you're confronted with many different files and a structure that already exists here that you have to adhere to. And in the beginning, it might be confusing, but the more you use Django, the more trivial all of this seems because it's always the same pattern. You have your settings, you have your URLs, and for every application, you have models, views, URLs, and then some stuff like admin features or forms, which we're also going to talk about in this crash course today. But that's basically it. You create an application, you define endpoints, you have some functionality, you map it to URLs, and then you just install the app and you include the URLs. That's basically what you do. So now to feel the success, how can we actually see if this works? I can just open up the terminal, and now we're going to use this manage.py file. We have this Python file here. Let me clear my terminal so you can see my command. All we're going to do now is we're going to say Python manage.py and then run server. This is what you do if you're not using UV. If you are using UV, you can just say UV run manage.py run server, same effect, run this. And now this is hosting the development server on port 8000 on your own computer on localhost. So if I open this now in the browser, you're going to see that it says page not found. This is expected. Why? Because we don't have any view that is pointed at just slash. So if we want to see our view, you need to go to /hello, and there you go, we see hello world. And to make this stick, we can do this just one more time with a different route. I can go now and create a second view. Maybe I can call this hello Python view, whatever I want. I can again make it take in a request, and I can just return some HTTP response where I could say hello Python. What would I need to do to make this accessible? I would need to go to the URLs PY of the to-dos application. I can copy this line and say this is hello Py, for example, or I can also just say, okay, that is the default endpoint. This is what I want to get if I just go to mysite.com, or in my case now localhost. Then I can swap this here for the hello Python view. And also don't forget to add a comma here because we're using multiple elements in a list. So add a comma here, then views hello Python view, and then we can call it hello Python. Then, of course, we don't need to do anything else because the app is already installed and it's also already including all the URLs, not just one. So look in the terminal, you don't even need to restart the server because you're running this in debug mode, which means that it already applied the changes. So I can just go to / and I will see hello Python. So just going to localhost shows me hello Python. Going to localhost /hello shows me hello world. So I hope you get the basic structure of Django. We have views. These views are reached through certain URL paths. These are included in the main URL paths, and that's basically it. But of course, now when we create such views, we usually don't just return HTTP responses like this. This is just for doing hello world stuff. If you actually want to serve something, you usually render HTML documents. So how is this properly done in Django? For this, we're going to create another view. I'm going to call this hello HTML view. And here now we're not just going to return a string, we're going to render an HTML file. So again, take in a request, and now we're going to use the render function, which is already included or imported here by default. And I'm going to say return render. And now what you want to do here is you want to provide the following path, the name of the app that you chose. So if you called it to do, if this directory here is called to do's, you just type to do's. If it's called something else, you type whatever it's called, and then / and the name of the HTML file you want to create. For example, let's go with hello.html. Now, in order to reach this file, this is a little bit odd. Maybe it's a bit confusing. What you need to do is you need to create a directory here in to-dos called templates. And in this templates directory, you need to create another directory which has the same name as the application. So here I want to create in templates now to-dos again. And in this to-dos directory, I'm going to create an HTML file, which I'm going to call hello.html. And this is necessary because that's the default path to the templates. If I say render something, then it's going to go to to-dos, hello HTML. It's going to assume it's in the templates directory. And this is just the way that you do it in Django, and not just in Django, also in Flask. I think you do it by repeating the name of the application to make it clear where you're getting this file from. So basically, if I go in here now and I just add a heading of size 1 and I say hello HTML and I close this tag, this would already serve this. The only thing I need to do, again, remember, is I need to add it as a path. So I can just copy this. Don't forget to add the comma. Now we can say /HTML render or something. This is going to be my hello HTML view. I'm going to call this hello HTML. And now I don't even need to restart the server. If I go to, what did I call it? HTML view or HTML render, I'm going to, of course, see a problem because I need to include one more thing when I call render. Forgot about this. If you want to do render, you need to pass the request as well. So you do render, request, and then the path to the template. So when I now do this, you can see I get the heading, hello HTML. But of course, the URL path can also contain interesting information. For example, I might have a database of to-dos, and if I want to look up a specific to-do, I could provide an identifier, for example. I can say I'm interested in to-do number 4. So this 4 can be part of the URL. And if it is part of the URL, I can parse it as a path parameter. So how do we do that? Let's create another view. Let's call it hello path. And we're going to take in request. And we're also going to take in a parameter here. So I'm going to add a parameter to this function, which could be name, for example. So let's say we provide a name in the path. For example, I could do something like I'm going to localhost or whatever the name is of the site / hello and then / Mike. And this should greet Mike. I want to get a message that says hello Mike just because I provided the string Mike in the URL. So let's keep it simple for this one and do an HTTP response again. And here I would return an F string, hello name, whatever the name was. But how do I get this now from the URL? I can do that easily in Django by just specifying angle brackets in this path here. So I add a comma here, I copy this, and let's say this is hello name. But it's not just hello name, it's hello name / and then the name of the person that I want to greet. So now I would use angle brackets. I would say that this is the name. I can do it just like this. Or if I want to force a data type, I can also specify that this is a string. This is done by prepending the data type. So str name, for example, or you could also say int, and then you could have some ID. But in our case, we have a name. So I'm going to do str name. And if I now go to hello name / Mike, I will get the string hello Mike. Let's try this out. I can go here to hello name / Mike. But of course, for this to work, we need to provide the correct view. So I'm going to go here with hello path. Let's call it hello path here as well. So now when I do it, you can see I get hello Mike. If I go and say Florian, which is my name, hello Florian. If I say John, hello John. So this is treated like a parameter in the URL. It also works, of course, now if I provide a number. So if I say 123, this will work because 123 can be parsed into a string. However, if I do something else, if I say this endpoint here is for addition, if I say add, and then I say integer, and let's say I call this num1 and then / and I add another one integer num2, and I'm going to still call this hello path, doesn't really matter, but I'm going to go back here and I'm going to say I'm getting now number1 and number2 as parameters. Then I could do something like returning number1 plus number2 to get the sum basically. And I can say sum is number1, number1 plus number2. Then of course this works. So if I say I get at 1, 2, 3 and then 10, for example, I get 133 because 123 plus 10 is 133. That's fine. But if I, for example, say now hello here, that is not going to work because it's going to tell me page not found. We don't have a route that takes in a string and an integer. We only have integer and integer. So I cannot process this request. Such a URL does not exist. Another way to submit information to an endpoint is by using query parameters. This would mean we don't include the information here as a path, but it would be something like, for example, I have a search endpoint and then I do $q is equal to some search query. This is a typical thing that you will see in web applications. So I can say here not hello path, I can say hello query if I want to call it that. Hello query, and then I could say this is again request. And this time I don't have a parameter in the function signature, but I use the query or the arguments that were passed to the request. So what I could do is I could say HTTP response, your query was, and then I can access the query from the request object. I can say request.get in capital letters. This is the method that we used. And it is also a dictionary containing our query parameters. So whatever we pass in the URL after the question mark and with the and symbols, we can retrieve this here using a get function. This time we're talking about lowercase get. I'm going to use double quotations now since we are already in a single quotation string. And I'm going to retrieve Q, for example, now. So what this basically means is if I have mysite.com/search, let's call it, and then I have question mark Q is equal to, then I would be retrieving this value here from Q by getting Q. If this is called query, I can retrieve it by saying get query. If this is called whatever, I can do that by retrieving whatever. And also I can combine this with Q is equal to, and or actually I shouldn't use all these symbols here, and name is equal to. So now I have multiple query parameters which I can access. So I can say get Q, get whatever, get name, and I'm retrieving these query parameters from the request. So let us now add this to the URLs. Let me just copy this. Let's call this hello query. Then let's say this is the hello query view, and let's also call this hello query. Save this, and now if I go and say /hello query If I don't pass anything, it's just going to say your query was none. If I say question mark q is equal to hello, then you can see your query was hello. If I say it's 1, 2, 3, then it says your query is 1, 2, 3. This is another way to retrieve data from the URL. So now the last thing I want to show you for the simple GET request before we move on to POST requests is you can not only return stuff, you can also redirect. And this is where these names now come into play, because if you want to redirect to something else, you can just specify the name of this particular path. So what I can do here in views is I can say I have some endpoint, let's call it, or some view, let's call it special view, whatever. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to redirect to another one. So I'm going to say request. And before that, of course, I can do stuff. I can, add a comment here, do some stuff. And instead of rendering something, instead of returning an HTTP response, I'm just going to redirect to an already existing endpoint. So I can just say return, redirect, and then I have to provide the name of the endpoint or of the view I want to redirect to. So I can go back to URLs py. And let's say I want to redirect to HTML render. So I can just go and take this hello HTML. This is the name. And I can say hello HTML is going to be my redirect. Redirect needs to be also imported here from shortcuts. So I have to say import render and redirect. And then basically I can register this as a URL. So let's copy this. Let's call this special. It's going to be the special view. Special is going to be the name as well. And if I save this now, if I go into the browser and I go to /special, then you can see I'm redirected to HTML render, and whatever I did before that is also being executed. Now, all these views and endpoints that we defined here accept GET requests. And a GET request is a very simple request. The client asks for something, the server gives it to the client. It returns a response, and that's basically it. If we as the client want to send something to the server, we need to do that via a POST request. Now you can theoretically also do that through a PUT request, and the convention is you use PUT for updating and POST for creating. But essentially with a POST request, you can send data to the server and the server can do something with that data. And in this case, what I mean by sending data is not just including it in the URL as a path or a query parameter, but as a request object. Usually we do this via a form. So what we can do now as an example is let's call this view post example. We still get a request. And what we do here now is we provide information about a person. So name, age, and job, for example. We can assume that we already have something that allows us to send a POST request. I'm going to show you how to do that here in a second. But for now, to implement this view here, this endpoint, we're going to assume that there's something that sends a POST request to our server, and this something transmits information. So here's the accepting point. Later on, we're going to see how to actually send a POST request. But for now, here we're going to accept the POST request and we're going to process it. So we can do that by saying the name is equal to request.post in capital letters, like get here. We have get and post. So request.post. And we're going to say from this POST request now, from this form, I want to get something called name. Now, of course, we need to make sure that whatever is sending the POST request sends actually something called name. So we have a key value pair where name is the key and the value is whatever. We have the same thing now for age. So I'm going to say get age, and we also have the same thing for job. That would be getting the data. Now you can do something with that. You can add an entry in the database. You can look up a person, do something, whatever. In our case, we're just going to return an HTTP response that tells us, okay, you transmitted this information, just to see how it works. So I can say here, return HTTP response, formatted string, and I can say you posted, and then name, age, and job. That would basically be it. Now, if we want to make sure that we're only accepting POST requests, we want to deny GET requests, for example, this endpoint, this view is only for posting data, for sending data with a payload, with a form. Then we can say that we want to check if the request.method is equal to post. And if that is the case, then we're going to do all of that. Otherwise, we're going to return an exception. We're going to raise an error code, namely the method not allowed code. Now, I don't want to go too deep here into the web stuff, so I'm not going to explain too much about GET requests, POST requests, and HTTP status codes. The basic in a nutshell summary here is the following. You have a couple of major types of requests that you can send: get for getting data, post for posting data, which means that you transmit data, usually for creation. Put is basically like post, but you usually use it to change stuff, to update stuff. Then you have delete, which is mostly used for deletion, obviously. And then you have some other stuff that is not super important right now. And the server always responds with a certain status code. So the server can give you some piece of information like a message, but it also tells you, okay, this was a successful request, usually 200. Now you can also have 201 and 202 for certain stuff like created, updated, whatever. But 200 and everything that starts with 200, that is something in the 200s, is a successful response. A successful request, the response to a successful request. 300 is usually something with redirecting. 400 is you as a client did something wrong. So your request was bad, because of that something failed. Now I'm giving you 400 something. A very famous one here being 404, which is not found because you entered a path that does not exist. And 500 is everything that has to do with server errors. So if on the server there is an exception, if something happens in my Python code that is my fault, then you're going to get 500 as a response. That's the in a nutshell explanation. Now, if you're using a method that is not allowed, that is on you. So it's 400. So what we can do here is we can say import HTTP response not allowed. So this is going to return not allowed. This is going to give us a 400 type of status code. So I can say here now, return not allowed, and we can say that we only accept post requests. So by adding this endpoint now to URLs, you can already see, I'm going to call this now post endpoint. I know my names are not super creative, but I want to keep it simple here. Post example. Also, I feel like by using random names, you can realize, okay, what's really important? I can use whatever I want here. I can use whatever I want here. And you see, okay, where do I have reserved keywords and where can I just do anything? So I'm using chaotic names here to show you that you can basically do whatever you want. So I can reload this and I can go here now to post endpoint and I should be greeted with an exception. There you go. You can see it here. HTTP error 405. If you Google that, you're going to see that's the code for not allowed, method not allowed. This means we're trying to do a GET request. You're always doing a GET request if you're just looking up an endpoint. If you're just typing something in a browser and you go to that URL, you're always doing a GET request. Post is when you click on a button after filling a form. That is a post request or a put request usually. When you delete something, when you click on a delete button, that's usually a delete request. But when you just visit a page, it's always GET. So right now I'm getting 405, which means this is not allowed. We're only accepting post requests. So to actually be able to submit a post request to this endpoint, we can use what we already know how to do. We can return an HTML document. Up here actually, render HTML, and in this HTML document I can just place a form, and this form can then submit a post request to this particular endpoint. So what I can do is I can say here submit example, which means we're going to render an HTML file that will contain a form where we can submit. So basically I'm just saying return render request, and then to-dos slash, I don't know, submit.html. And I know right now we're not doing anything with to-dos here, but still we're going to be managing to-dos here in a second. For now, we're just going to explore the different ways to send requests. But now, again, we do what we already know how to do. We create a new HTML file here. So I say new file, submit.html. And now this is stuff that I assume you already know. If you know some basic web stuff, we just create a form. We say the form has the method post. This is important, of course, because we want to do a post request. Not sure if I can use single quotations in HTML, so let's go with a double quotations. Method post. Action is important. Action is the endpoint. Where are we posting to? What endpoint are we targeting? This is what we need to provide here, because if we don't provide that, it's just going to be referencing itself. It's just going to post onto itself. Now, for this here, we're going to use something that I'm going to cover a little bit later in this tutorial or in this crash course, but we're going to use it here because we need it. We can use templating. We can use in Django a templating engine. It can do a lot of things, which we're going to talk about. But for now, we're just going to use one feature of that, which is we can target a certain URL that is defined here again by its name. So we want to post to post example. This is the name of this particular endpoint here. So in the HTML, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use curly brackets. This is the Django templating. I'm going to use percentage. So curly bracket, percentage, percentage, curly bracket, and in between I'm going to say URL and then I'm going to target post example. This means we now have a form that posts onto this URL. So I can close the form, and in here I can add some fields, input, type, text. Name is going to be equal to name. This is important. Whatever we provide here as name has to match what we're waiting for in the views. So here we're waiting for name, age, job. This is what we also need to provide here as the names. The placeholder is just for styling, but I'm going to add one so we know what we're dealing with. And now I'm going to just copy paste age, job, age, job. And the most important thing, if you want to submit, you also need a button. Button type is going to be equal to submit. And in here, I'm going to say send post. That is a very basic HTML file. It's rendered by this view here, submit example. Of course, we need to add this view to our URLs file. So I'm going to say submit endpoint, submit example, submit example. And now I can go to the submit endpoint. And as you can see, I now have this not so well designed form in front of me where I can provide some information like Florian is my name, 26 is my current age, and then I can say job is, let's say, programmer. And now I can click on send post. And it's great that this happened now. We got a problem because we didn't include a so-called cross-site request forgery token. This is a security vulnerability. I don't want to explain it now in too much detail, but basically if you don't provide this CSRF token in your form, you cannot post. So this is something that you always need to include. And you saw what happens when you don't do that. So you want to go now to your submit HTML and you want to add it up here just with curly brackets, percentage, and then CSRF token. By just adding this, if we go back, now we have the token here. I'm going to provide the information again, Florian 26 programmer. If I now post, everything works and I get you posted Florian 26 program. Now, this is one way of working with forms in Django. You specify the input fields manually, you go to views, you parse them manually, you validate them manually. It's possible, you can do it like that, but in Django, there's a more professional and more convenient way, which is to use forms or form classes. So what we can do is we can go into our to-dos app. I can right click, create a new file, which I'm going to call forms.py. Now, you don't need to call it forms.py. You also don't necessarily need to put it in its own file. This is just a best practice. You create a forms.py, and in here now we can say from Django import forms. And instead of specifying the fields individually in the HTML and parsing them individually, I can model them as a class. So I can say, for example, class person form, and I can say that this inherits from forms.form. And now I can just specify what a person form contains. So I can say there's a name field, and the name field is going to be forms.char field. So character field for characters, so for strings basically. I can say I allow a maximum of 100 characters. This is a validation criterion, so I'm not just saying this is a text field or a char field, I'm saying there's only a maximum of 100 characters allowed. If you enter something else, it leads to the form not being valid, which is important because using these form classes also allows us to do easy validation. Another thing I can specify here is required equals true. Now, this is the default. You don't need to do that. You can also just not specify it and it will be required. But of course, you can say required equals false to make it optional. This is something you can do here. For the sake of mentioning this, I'm just going to keep it here explicitly as true just to show you that this works. And then we're going to say here label is equal to whatever you want to have as a label when you render this into HTML. In my case here, I'm going to say your name. Now we can do the same thing with age. Age is going to be forms, integer field, label, your age. And here now I'm not going to say required equals true. It's still going to be required because that's default. You're going to see that this is the case. And finally, I'm going to copy the name and I'm going to put it down here, rename it to job. And I'm going to change the label to your job, and I'm going to make this not required. So this is going to be optional. I'm going to set required equal to false. So we now have this form class, and in views.py now, in the post example endpoint or view here, what we can do now is we can initialize a person form object and fill it with the post data. So for this, of course, we need to import the respective class from .forms import person form. And then down here, we're not going to go and get the data from the post request directly. What we're going to do is we're going to get it from the form. The form itself is going to get it from the post dictionary. So that remains the same. But the extra thing that we have here conveniently is the validation. So what I can do here now is I can say form is equal to person form. The person form will be initialized with request.post. So we get all the data that we had before. We feed it into the person form class. We create an instance of this class. It now contains all the information, and then we can do a validation check. If form.is valid, then only we want to parse the information. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything. And of course, this validation can be much more interesting. We can implement custom validators that are much more complicated. For now, we just have max length and required fields, very simple, but this can be extended to be much more feature rich. But we're going to keep it simple. We're going to say now name is equal to form.cleaned data, and from cleaned data, I'm going to access name. Now I'm going to copy paste this, age, job. And then I can indent this, and basically we now have the same functionality as before, just with an additional validation. Now I can also pass an empty form instead of specifying the fields manually in the HTML, which also means that if I have multiple places where I have to do something with this form, I can just pass the class everywhere and I can change everything I want to change in this form class. So right now, let's go copy this and create an additional endpoint here. I'm going to say submit, let's call this submit Django form, just so we know what this is about. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pass an empty form object as context to the rendering. So I'm going to say here form is equal to person form. Here we don't have any post data to initialize this with, so we're just going to go with the default, which is empty. And we're going to say here, first of all, a different HTML document. Let's call this submit Django form. And here now I'm going to pass a dictionary. The dictionary will contain a field form. You can call this also something else. And this will be our form object, which we're going to use to fill it and then transmit it to the post example endpoint. And for this, we can just copy the submit HTML. So I can copy this, I can paste this here, I can rename it to have the proper name. So submit Django form. And now I get rid of all these input fields. And what I do instead is I use double curly brackets to access the context. And then I say the form dot as paragraph. So as p. Form as p is going to take the form, render it into this HTML document, and it's going to be submitted to post example, which fills up a person form object with the data. So of course we need to also again create an endpoint for this. Maybe let's call this one submit Django or whatever. Submit Django form, submit Django. And now let's go and say submit Django. And you can see we now have the form rendered also with the labels, your name, your age, and your job. I can specify the same information as before, and I will hopefully get the same result. There you go, you posted Florian 26 programmer. Now, if I try to do something like copy my name way too many times, in this case, I think it just cuts off the input, so I cannot type anymore. So that's also a form of validation, but in general, it just validates everything properly. So that's basically it for the basic request handling in Django. I want to show you one more thing before we move on to the database stuff. But essentially, to briefly recap, what did we do? We covered basic requests, GET requests, and how we can respond with HTTP response objects, how we can render HTML documents, how we can process URL parameters, how we can process query parameters, how we can redirect, how we can handle post requests, and also how to work with forms, how we can either specify them manually or how we can use Django Forms professionally using classes. Now, the last thing I want to show you before we move on to the database stuff is how to work with templates. And to some degree, we already touched on this a little bit. We used something like this. We used something like the token here. We also now rendered the form as p with these double curly brackets, but I want to cover this now in a little bit more detail. So let's go ahead back to the views and let's create a, I don't know, let's call it template view. And I'm going to keep it simple here. We're just going to have some context, and this context can be everything. It can be something from your database. It can be something you retrieve from an API. It can be something you generate, whatever. You have something that you want to pass to the HTML document that you're rendering, and there you want to do something with it. So my context here is going to be quite simple, a dictionary, and this dictionary will contain a couple of key value pairs. Name is going to be Mike, age is going to be 30, and then we're not going to go with job this time, we're going to go with skills. And the reason for that is I want to have a list. And this list will now contain a couple of things that Mike can do. Python, SQL, Docker, for example. And now basically just what we already did before, return, render, request, and then we're going to render some template files. So let's call this to-dos template demo.html. And now we're going to pass the context here. So nothing about this is new. We already did it here, but now we're going to see how we can actually work with the data on the HTML side. So with Django's templating engine, I'm going to right click here. I'm going to open up a new file. I'm going to call this now template demo.html. And here now we get all this context and can work with it. So let me show you very simply what this means. If I just go ahead and create a heading 1, what I can do is in this heading 1, I can use double curly brackets to access any of these values. So I can say name, for example, and I can also say age, for example, and I can also say skills, for example. And what happens now, of course, I need to register this one more time as a URL. Let's call this templating, template view, templating. Now when I go to templating, you can see that the information is shown on the page. So what I pass to HTML can be accessed with double curly brackets. But we cannot just render these values here, we can also do stuff with them. For example, skills is a list of skills, and what I might want to do is create a bullet list with all my skills. So I might want to have something like an unordered list here, and in here I might want to have a list item for every single skill. So something like an iteration over the skills, and every single skill is going to be a list item with the respective text. Now, if I want to do that, I can do that. I just have to use a different syntax. So I create this unordered list, and then I use curly brackets with percentage, and then I can say for skill in skills. And basically now I can also close this with another curly bracket set and percentage. So basically again, curly brackets, percentage signs, and in here I say end for. This is a bit like curly brackets in Java or C++. This is the beginning, this is the end, and in between is each iteration. So for every skill in skills, basically create a list item. The content of this is going to be again in double curly brackets skill. So this is our running variable here. We have for skill in skills, create a list item where the skill is listed. So now I can run this and you can see Python, SQL, Docker. But we can not only use loops, we can also have conditions. For example, I might want to display a special message. Let's say this is a paragraph and I want to say that the name, whatever the name is, Mike in this case, is very competent. Or maybe we want to say something like has a lot of skills. But I don't want to always display this message. I only want to display this if the number of skills that Mike has is greater than 3, for example. So I need a condition here. How do I do that? I use curly brackets, percentage, and then I say if skills. And now I use something called a filter. I use a pipe symbol, so this straight line here, to say, okay, from skills, I want to feed skills through a filter, and this filter is called length. This is a predefined filter in Django. So what this basically means is give me the number of elements that skills contains. And if that is greater than 3, then we want to display this message. Otherwise here, I can say either else or elif, or I can say just end if. This would be like end for, just a closing equivalent here. And in this case now, what would happen is we would not get the message. So I can run this, nothing happens. If I now go back to views py and change the context to be Python, SQL, Docker, and let's say Java, then I will see Mike has a lot of skills because now I have 4 elements, 4 is greater than 3. So I see this message, quite simple. Now I can also say, okay, if I don't have more than 3 skills, but for example, I do have Django as part of the skill set. So I can say here, elif Django is part of the skills, so in skills. Then I might want to display here that Mike knows Django. That is awesome. So in this case, if I have less than 3 or less than or equal to 3 skills, but I have Django as one of them, at least I'm going to see this message. So let's go back. Let's say we only have 3 skills here, and instead of Docker, I'm now going to say I have Django as a skill. Then I should be able to see the other message, which is Mike knows Django. That is awesome. But if I add an additional skill here, if I say Docker is also one now the first if triggers and I just get Mike has a lot of skills. And then of course we can also introduce an else branch. So I can just say here again with curly brackets and percentage else, and then we can say Mike doesn't know a lot. Yeah, it's a bit mean, but we can do it like this. And now if I go and say, let's remove these two, I only have Python and SQL, then we can see, yeah, Mike doesn't know a lot. Now, what also makes sense oftentimes is to have something called a base template. So if I go here now and I create a new file, which I call base.html, I might want to have a certain structure that every single page should have. So for example, here I can use a shortcut to generate this HTML5 structure. What I have here is doc type, HTML, HTML head, then meta, character set, title, and then the body. This is like a basic structure. Maybe I also want to have some navigation here or something. Very, very basic structure that should be part of all the pages that I implement. So all the other HTML documents, they might differ in the content, but they should have the same structure with the same style sheet and JavaScript and everything. There's stuff that has to be present in all pages. So for example, just to show you that this actually works, let's create a header. Maybe I can use here this shortcut to create it. And here I will just say, this is my tutorial application. And then I will have a main section, and this main section will be customizable. So here I'm going to say now with these Django templating syntax, I'm going to say block content. So block content basically means here is going to be the content block. I'm also going to close it right away. So I'm going to say here end block. And basically the page will be, or every other page will be able to insert content here in this main section. And then I might have something like a footer where I say copyright neural 9, whatever, maybe with end copy. And then you have, yeah, basically, let's go with 2025. So that would basically mean now every page that extends this page will have the same header, the same footer. You can also add a navigation, but this section here will be different. Now we can also do the same thing with the title, because of course, not every page is going to have the same title. Maybe I will have always tutorial, but then I want to have something customizable. What I can do is curly brackets, percentage, block title, and then I can just say end block again. So that would be my base template. Now, if I want to use this, let's go back to the template demo. All I have to do is at the very top of the file, I have to use again the syntax with curly brackets and percentage. And then I need to say extends and then a string to-dos / base.html. And of course, I cannot just put the content here without any specification. What I need to do is I need to fill the blocks. So I'm going to use here again curly brackets. I'm going to say block title. And I'm going to say, for example, templating here as this title or as a title for this particular page, end block. And down here, this is the content I want to fill. So I'm going to say percentage block content, and that is going to be all the content. And at the end, I'm going to say end block. There you go. So now if I go to this page, you can see tutorial application, copyright, everything in between. You can also see tutorial templating up here in the title. This is because we're extending from this base template. So for this crash course, I would say we covered enough when it comes to request handling, post request, get request, different parameters, different ways of using forms, also templating. Now we're going to go into databases. So how can we interact with the database? Every web application needs a database, if it is just for user authentication or for handling to-dos, creating them, listing them, editing them. All of this happens in a database. And of course, the database is a different world than Python. So in Python, you have objects, you have to work with Python objects. In a database, you have tables, you do select statements, insert statements, alter table statements, update statements, delete statements. These are two different worlds, you could say. So to connect these two different worlds, in a nutshell, you need something called an ORM, an object relational mapper. You need to map Python objects to database entries. Now, one way to do that is using a package like SQL Alchemy, but in Django, you can just use the Django ORM, so the Django Object Relational Mapper, which is by default provided to you by just using Django models. So remember, we had the settings py file, and down here we had databases. This by default just connects to a database file called db.sqlite3. So it's just a basic SQLite 3 database, which is initialized automatically when you open the application for the first time. So you can see here db.sqlite3 doesn't yet contain any important information for the application itself, but we can add tables to this database without ever writing SQL code. So if I go, for example, here to models now, and I say I want to manage to-dos in my application, how do I do that? I can just create a class that I can then use in Python, and this class will map onto database rows, or actually the class will map onto a database table, and the individual objects will map onto rows in that table. So let's keep it simple here. What we can do is we can say class to do, and this is going to be models.model. So this is now a database model. This will be translated into a database table. To do will be a table in the database, and the respective class in Python that we map to this table is going to be called to do. And now I can define the fields of a to do very similar to how we define the fields of a form. So I can say a to do has a title, and a title is going to be a models.character field. We know that already from the form. So now I'm saying there is a title. The title can have a maximum length of, let's say, 100 again. And now, similar to the person form, we now have a database column, which is a string column or a character column, character field column, that has a limit of 100 characters. Same thing, I can go copy this and say I also have a description. So now let's say for the description, maybe 500 is the max length. And then we can also say done is equal to models.boolean field. So this would be a boolean that indicates whether a to-do was completed or not. And here we need to understand something. All of these fields, all of these columns by default are not nullable. Nullable means we can enter null as a value. We can enter none, undefined, empty, whatever as a value. And that is not the case by default. So if I create a field done as a boolean field, this field needs to be filled, which means that when I create a to-do, I need to specify what done is. Now, I have two possibilities to counteract that. I can make the field nullable by saying null is equal to true, and then also blank is equal to true for the forms. Or I can say, no, I want this field to actually be not nullable, but I don't want to have to specify it manually every single time. So what I can do is I can also provide a default. In this case now, done is a required field. It needs to be filled, but if I don't provide anything, it's just going to be false by default. Then we also have other sorts of fields. So for example, I can say deadline is equal to models.date field. If I want to have a specific date, I can also go for date time if I want to include the time. Let's just go with date field here. But for this one, I also want to keep it nullable and blankable. So null equals true, blank is equal to true. It's not a required field. And then maybe let's do something a little bit more exotic. Let's go with priority. Priority should be an integer field, but I don't want this to be an arbitrary number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say models.integer field, but I'm going to make sure only specific values are accepted here. So this happens now on a Django level. I'm going to specify I want 3 possible choices. So I'm going to create a class up here. I'm going to call it priority choices. It's going to inherit from models integer choices. So now we have this separate class that just models all the possible integer values that I accept as priority. It's going to be a little bit like an enum. So I'm going to say here low is going to be equal to 1 and then comma low. So that basically means this is the string version. Low 1 is the value and low is here the actual enum value that I can use in Python. Then I can say medium is going to be equal to 2, medium. And then I can say high is equal to 3 high. Now with this choices class, what I can do now in the integer field is I can say choices is equal to priority choices.choices. And of course I can also make this optional if I want to, which I'm going to do in this case. But basically now I can provide a priority for this to do, which can either be low, medium, or high, which in the database is 1, 2, or 3. What I can also do if I want to have a representation method for this to do is I can add a dunder. I think you should know what this is already in Python. Just __str___ determines what happens when we typecast this into a string. So in our case here, I'm going to just say that this should return the title and maybe the ID. This is another thing that you need to understand here. Even though we didn't specify the ID field, every class already has the ID field unless we explicitly define the primary key. But now if I create a to-do, this to-do will have an ID, which means here in the formatted string that I'm going to return, I can just say self.id and then self.title, for example. So when I now print a to-do object in Python, I will see the ID and the title instead of some odd string representation that is the default in Django. So now let's go and apply the knowledge that we already have to create a view that allows us to create to-dos and also to see what kind of to-dos we already have. We're going to do this slightly differently now because I want to show you a different approach. We can get and post on the same endpoint. This is not a problem. We just need to distinguish with the request.method. So I'm going to say here def to-dos. We're going to get a request, and basically I'm going to say if request.method is equal to post, If that is the case, we're going to do something. I'm going to define this later. Somewhere in here, we're going to return at some point. And otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to get all the to-dos objects and we're going to return them. Or I should say, we're going to render them into the HTML. So we're going to return the rendered HTML, but we're going to include all the to-dos as context to be rendered in the HTML document. So maybe also let's call this to-dos view to make this a little bit more professional. And in the get case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say to-dos is equal to to-do. Now for this, of course, I need to import the class. So I'm going to say here from models import to-do. And then down here, we're going to say, give me all the to-do objects. So to-dos is going to be equal to to-do objects all. This is how you get all the objects for the to-do class. So this basically means select everything from the to-dos table in the database, get it into the Python format, and now give me all the objects that are related to all the rows in the database. And in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to render a document. So we pass request here again, and then we're going to render to-dos /todos.html. And as context here, we're going to pass to-dos, which is going to be to-dos. So that's it basically for the get branch. Now we need to handle the posting, the creation of new to-dos. And here we're going to use Django Forms again, but we're going to use a different parent class, not the ordinary forms class. We're going to use model forms. So for this, I'm going to go into forms.py and I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call this to-dos form or to-do form. But this time we inherit from forms.modelForm, not just from form. And this has the advantage that I now just have to specify the model that we already have, and it will generate a form based on that. So all I have to do is I have to say here class meta. So we have a meta class in to-do form. I need to specify that the model is equal to to-do. For this, of course, I need to again import it. So from .models import to-do. And then I can specify the fields that I want to have in this particular form. I can have multiple forms for the same model. One can be a little bit more concise. One can only contain the required fields. One can be more customized. But in our case here, I'm just going to say fields is equal to title, description, done, deadline, and priority. And the coolest thing now is I can also customize the widgets. So for example, for deadline, I don't want to have just a simple text input. I want to have a date picker. How do I do that? I can say widgets is a dictionary, and I'm going to map the field deadline to forms.date input. And I'm going to pass here the keyword argument attributes or ATTRS. And I'm going to say type date. So the idea in terms of how we use it is the exact same as the person form, but we don't need to specify character fields, integer fields, Boolean fields again. We can just say, take everything from the to-do class, which is this one here. It has the definitions already in here with all the blanks being true or false for the form. And then we can just use that. So in our view, we're going to handle this basically the same way that we handled the person object. We're just going to say here to-do is equal to to-do form. Of course, this needs to be imported as well now. So to-do form needs to be imported from forms. And this to-do form will be filled with request.post. If this form is valid, so if to-do is valid, maybe I should not call this to-do, let's call this form. If form is valid, then we're going to actually create this object in the database. So now we're not just talking about submitting the post data, we're also going to create a database object. And how do we do that? We can do that very easily by just referring to the form directly. I'm also going to show you how to do that manually later on in the manage py shell. But for now, we're going to just say here to-do is equal to form.save. So what this does is it creates automatically a to-do instance based on the to-do form. Since this is a model form, this is possible, and saves it to the database right away. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to return an HTTP response with to-do successfully created. So actually, we're not going to have a return here. Actually, let's handle this with an else branch to keep this simple. We're just going to say this happens if this is not a post request. In this case, just get all the to-dos and render them. But of course, what we also want to do here is we want to submit the form for the actual creation. So don't forget to also add up here that the form is going to be equal to a to-do form, again, with no values by default. And we're going to pass this also here to the context. So I'm going to say here that the form is going to be the form. And now in order to save time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file, which I'm going to call todos.html, and I'm going to copy paste the code because this is exactly what we already did. There's nothing new in here. I'm just going to paste this. We're extending the base template as before. We're replacing the title block as before. We have the content block as before. In here, we have an unordered list for to do in to-dos with the templating engine here. Just show as a list item to do ID, to do title, to do done, nothing new. And then down here, we have for method post. We don't provide an action because we're posting to the same endpoint. We're posting to ourselves, so we don't need to provide the action. We have a CSRF token, we have the form ASP, and we have a button for submission. Super simple, exactly what we already did before. So not wasting the time by typing all of this out. And now let's go to the URLs. Let's create a new endpoint here. Let's call it to-dos, views.to-dos, name is to-dos. Or actually I need to call this to-dos view. So that is the correct name. So what we cannot do right now is expect this to work right away. What we need to do is we need to migrate these changes, these additions to the database. We created now a new Python class, a new Django model here, but the changes were not yet applied on the database level. What this means is we need to actually open up the command line. We need to close the server. We need to stop the server. And now we need to do the migration. So how do we do the migration? We go, I'm going to clear the screen now. Let me zoom in a little bit, close the file Explorer here. What we're going to do now is we're going to run, if you're not using UV, you're just going to run Python or Python 3 manage py and then make migrations. So manage py, make migrations. In my case, I'm going to do UV run manage py, make migrations. What this is going to do is it's going to create a file that applies the changes of our models to the database. So if you're interested in that, you can also take a look at it. You can just go up here in the to-dos application to migrations. You can click on this, then we can zoom out a bit and you can see what exactly has to be done for the database to match what changed in our code. So in our code, we created a model with the name to do, with the fields that we specified here. We have ID implicitly created here as a primary key. As you can see, this is what happens on a database level now to match this. So if I actually now want to perform the migration, I need to also say migrate. So again, Python manage py migrate, or in my case, it's going to be UV run manage py migrate. So now you can see all of this was created. This also, as you can see, includes tables that Django now created that are part of the Django default. So we have authentication, admin. We're going to talk about admin here in a second, but we also see to-dos was created here. So now we can go back, say UV run manage py run server. I know my camera is blocking this, but we had this command already. There you go, run server. And now I can go here and I can say /to-dos. And here I have my form for creating a new to-do. Let's go and try something. Let's say I need to code AGI. Solving all problems. Then I will say this is not done. I will pick a date, like let's say this one here, and I will pick medium as a priority. So now I can save this, to-do successfully created. I can reload the page, or actually I don't want to reload with submission. So let me just go to to-dos again. And now you can see here in the bullet list, I have one code AGI done false. So now we can repeat that. I can just type in some stuff. So we have some to-dos here. I can also leave the date empty. I can go back. I can do the same thing again. There you go. And you can see we get all the to-dos listed here. Now, usually when working on an application, you don't have isolated tables. So you don't have to-dos and then you have tasks and then you have calendar entries and then you have users. Usually you have all of these tables interconnected. Now, we're not going to go deep into everything that you can do here, but I want to show you a simple example of connecting two tables by introducing a person table, and the person is going to be the owner of a to-do. So we're going to keep it simple here. Up at the top, I'm going to say class person. Person is going to be a model, so models.model. And the person will have a name. The name is going to be a character field. Let's say max length is 100. And then I'm going to say age is going to be models.integer field. And let me also use the string dunder so that later on when we use this in the shell, we can actually see, and also in the admin panel, we can actually see the correct representation. I'm gonna copy this and replace title by name. And now what I want to do is I want to say every to-do has to be owned by a person. How do I do that? I can go down here to the to-do and I can say every to-do has an owner, and this owner is going to be a foreign key. This is what we call this in database language. A foreign key means we're referencing here the primary key of the person. So in this case, we're going to reference the person ID, which is implicitly created here since we didn't manually specify a primary key. The ID of the person is going to be part of the to-do table to say that this to-do belongs to the person with ID, whatever the ID is. So how do we do that? Basically, we say foreign key person, and then we can define what happens on deletion. So I can say on delete models.cascade, which basically means if we delete the person, all the to-dos that belong to that person will be deleted as well. Alternatively, we also have protect, which basically means prevent the deletion of a person if there are to-dos out there that are still owned by that person. So depending on what you want to do on a database level, what you want to have, what kind of security you want to have here, you can choose the method. In my case here, I'm going to go with cascade, which means delete all the to-dos when a person that is the owner is deleted. And then we can also specify here a related name. This is quite useful because we're mapping the database world into the Python world and vice versa. And what the related name means is I'm going to call this now to-dos. Since we have multiple to-dos that can be owned by the same person, we don't have a unique constraint here. What this basically means is that the person object is linked to multiple to-dos. And on a programmatic level, instead of doing some iteration or some joining, what I can do is I can just say person.todos to get a list of all the to-dos. And to not mess up the already existing data, I'm going to say blank is equal to true and null is equal to true, which basically means we don't need to have an owner. We can also have a standalone to-do. So now one simple thing that we can do is we can go to todos HTML and we can just say display also the owner. I can say here owned by, and then I can say to-do.owner and then .name, for example. So this would go to-do, the person, and the name of the person. Again, to make this possible, we need to go into the command line. We need to actually stop the server. I need to say again, in my case, uv run manage pi and then make migrations. You first always make the migrations, then you actually apply them by doing migrate. And now we have the person also as part of the database schema. Then also run server again, and then I can refresh this and you can see owned by nobody. And I'm going to show you how we can add the people later on. For now, we're just going to ignore it. We're not going to add the person here in this form. I'm going to show you a different way that is a little bit more convenient for our purposes. But before we do that, I want to show you how we can also delete stuff and filter data if needed. For this, I'm going to create a new endpoint here, which I'm going to call person details. So let's say I want to have person details for a specific person though. So I'm going to get request and I want to provide a person ID to get information about that person. So of course, right now we don't have person data. We're going to change that in a second. But for now, I just want to show you how would we actually filter a person based on ID. Quite simple. Instead of doing objects all, like up here for the to-dos, I can just say the person you're looking for is person objects filter. And now I can specify, okay, what I'm actually looking for is that the person ID is equal to the person ID. In this case, ID is equal to the parameter person ID that was passed here. And of course, I need to import person up here from models. And this basically gives me a query set, a result set with all the person objects where this is true. Now, since this is a primary key, there's only going to be a single person where this is the case, if at all. And because of that, I can get the first element, which is always going to be the only element, by calling .first. So that's going to give me the one person that has this ID. And then I can just say return render to-dos / person details.html. And I can provide this context here. The person is the person. For this, I'm also going to copy paste the HTML again, because it's just the same stuff that we already did. Person details. And what we're doing here, basically, this part might be a little bit interesting, is we are iterating over the to-dos that are owned by that person. So we're going to use this once we have person objects. I'm just coding it now. We're going to use it later. But basically, we're saying for to-do in person.todos.all. So this .todos is exactly what we defined in models py as the related name. Remember, here we had foreign key related name. That basically means that we can now access the list of to-dos that are owned by person just by saying person.todos. This can also be done in Python code, not just in the HTML templating, and all gives us just all the objects that we can iterate over. So by doing that, we can iterate on the person page over all the to-dos that are owned by that person. So I'm going to register this as an endpoint, but we're going to use it later on. For now, I'm going to say person / and then int person ID. that is going to use the person details view. Person details is going to be the name. And the reason, if you're wondering why I'm not showing this yet, is because I want to show you how to use the admin feature to create all of this without having to, for administrative purposes, create a form and a user interface for everything. But before we go there, I want to show you two more things manually so you see how it's done. One is updating an entry and another one is deleting an entry. So let's start with the deletion. It's quite simple. I'm going to say delete to do is going to be just done. In this case, I know it's not professional. We're going to do it with a simple GET request here just to make it simple, because I want to show you how to work on the database level with deletion. It's also not too fancy, but essentially we're going to get a to-do ID here again as a URL parameter. And then we're going to say to-do is equal to to-do objects filter ID is equal to to-do ID, exactly the same as above. And then also the only object that matches this. And then I can just say to-do.delete. This is going to delete it from the database. And then I can keep it simple and say to-do as an HTTP response, to-do successfully deleted. So that's the only new thing here, that you can call delete on an entry to delete it from the database. Now for the updating, we're going to do something simple. We're just going to toggle the done or not done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say def toggle to do done request to do ID. And here the same thing. I can say to do is equal to do objects filter ID is equal to do ID. By the way, you don't have to use this filter. You can also do something like done is equal to false. This would give you all the uncompleted to-dos. You can also combine this by saying done false and also something else, like for example, the date is after a certain point in time. You can just provide multiple keywords here in the filter function, but we are just interested in a single to do, getting this particular element, and then saying to do dot done is going to be equal to not what it is right now. So we're just going to flip it. We're going to negate it. And to apply the changes to the database, we need to say to do dot save. Cool. So we're going to add all of this as well here as a path. I'm going to say delete to do ID, delete to do, and then toggle to do ID, toggle to do done, and then toggle to do. So right now you can see we have these three to-dos. If I go now and say these two are true, this one is false. If I go now to toggle to do /1, which is false right now, if I do that, to do successfully updated. If I refresh, now I have true here. If I go and say toggle to do 2 from true, it's going to change to false. And there you go, this changed. Just so you see this works. If I go now and say delete to do 2, then it's deleted and I only have these two left. Quite simple. Now, instead of doing all of this here manually, what we can also do is we can use the built-in admin feature of Django. So I talked about in the very beginning briefly that Django has batteries included. Batteries included means a lot of the stuff that we already saw with the forms and with the models and all that, but it also has the battery of an admin panel included in it. So if I go to whatever URL I'm working with and then /admin, I will see the Django administration panel. Now here it requires a username and password. We don't have that yet. So what we actually need to do is we need to open up in our editor, our command line. We need to stop the server and then we're going to use manage py to create a super user. So let me actually clear the command line and I'm going to say here now uv run manage py and then create super user. And of course, if you're not using UV, you do Python, manage py, create super user. So in my case now, I'm going to call this root. I'm going to use no email. The password is going to be root again. It says it fails the validation, but I can just bypass it because this is now for tutorial purposes. Now I have a super user, which is called root with the password root. I can run the server. I can reload the page. I can say root. And now it tells me the password is weak. Now you can see actually nothing. You can see that we have users, we have groups, but we don't have our database models that we just created accessible here. We cannot create them, we cannot change them, we cannot delete them. Why is that? The reason for that is we did not register them for the admin panel. If you look at the files you have here in each application, if you have multiple, you will find this admin.py file. And what you need to do here in order to make a model accessible in this admin panel is you need to register it. So what you do is you say from models import to do and person. And then you just say admin.site.register to do. And also the same with person. Once you have this, you can reload, and there you go, we have persons and to-dos. So if I click on it, you can see I don't have persons in this database. Actually, it should be called people, but it doesn't really matter. But when I go to to-dos, you can see I have my two to-do entries here, and I can click on them, and I can see here the date picker. I can change the priority here. I can change the description. I can actually do it also. So I can change this to coding AGI, save. I can also just delete here if I want to. So I can do basic CRUD stuff without having to implement anything. And also I can go ahead now and create a new person. So I can say new person is, actually let's use the suggestion Florian. Let's go with 27, even though that's not my age. And now I can go to a to-do, let's say this one, and I can say that the owner of this to-do is Florian. So I have access here to all the people, and I can connect these two tables in the admin panel. This is one more example of batteries being included in Django. Now, the coolest thing is you can also massively customize that. So if I don't want to just register it, if I want to customize the way that this is registered, I can also do that with a class. For example, in my to-dos here, I would like to see different columns for different values already here in the list view. And I also want to be able to search and filter. So how do I do that? I go back into admin PY, and instead of doing admin side register, I create a class. So I say admin.register as a decorator. I pass to do as the class here, and then I say class to do admin inherits from admin model admin. And here now I can say what kind of columns do I want to display in the list view. So I can say list display is equal to the following tuple. I want to have title, I want to have priority, I want to have deadline, and I want to have done. Then what kind of fields do I want to be able to search for? So I can say search fields is equal to, and let's say I'm only interested in searching for title. Now to make this a tuple, I need to add a comma here. And then maybe I also want to have some filters. So list filter could be, for example, filtering by priority and by deadline. So now I have this class, I customized my admin interface, and if I now reload the page, you can see that I get title, priority, deadline, done. I also get the filters here, so I can filter by priority if I want to. I can also filter by deadline, past 7 days, this month, and so on. And I can also search, say code, search, and I get code AGI. And you can see I get this nice view with my customized columns. So the admin panel in Django is actually super convenient and super useful. You basically don't have to do anything in order to be able to have a basic management system. And of course, you can customize this as much as you want. So now that I created a person and also assigned a to-do, we can go to person details /1. Actually, it was just person, not person details. And I, of course, again, also forgot to specify or to pass request here. So render request, but now it should work. There you go. Hello, Florian, and you can see my to-dos. Now, another thing that I would like to show you at this point is how you can interact with your application and the data using the manage PY shell. So what you can do is you can go to your project directory and say uv-run or Python manage PY shell, and this is going to open up an interactive Python shell that you can use to interact with the database. So I can say, for example, from to-dos.models import everything. Now I have to do in person as class is imported, and I can say to do objects all, for example, to get a list of all the to-dos. Here you can see the query set to do 1, to do 3. Then I can also do stuff like filter, and I can play around basically. This is just for experimenting or doing some small stuff in the CLI. If you prefer that over the Django admin interface, you can just say, for example, to do objects filter, where the owner, now how do we do that? If you want to have here in the filter, the owner __ is to access the name. So owner name is equal to Florian, for example. Give me all the to-dos where the owner of the to-do has the name Florian. In this case, just the first one, code AGI. And we can also do the same thing as before. I can say .first, this will give me this specific to-do, and I can say then .delete to get rid of it from the database. And then also in the browser, you can see this to-do is no longer existing. Now, then I would also briefly like to show you how we can serve static files, at least in development. In production, you always do this a little bit differently with collect static and so on. But if you want to do this here now in the Django application, you go to settings PY, you scroll down to static URL. So you can leave static URL as it is, but you also want to add static files underscore dirs is equal to, and now you want to combine the base URL with static. Basically base underscore dir slash static. And base dir is actually defined at the very top here. This is just a directory of this project. Now with this, we can create another directory here at the same level as core and to-dos called static. So I can say static, and here I can serve CSS and JavaScript, for example. However, to actually be able to access the static files, I also need to manipulate a line in urls.py, or I need to add a line actually. So I'm going to say here URL patterns plus equals, and for this I actually need another import from django.conf.urls.static import static, and I'm going to say URL patterns plus equals static settings.static underscore URL. Now to get the settings, this is another one. We need to say from Django conf import settings. This is going to give us the settings that are defined in settings.py. This is how we access that. We get the static URL from the settings, and we also say document root is equal to settings.static URL. Sorry, this time not static URL, static root. And the final thing that we need to do to actually make this possible is in our base template, we also need to include this. So we're going to go to base HTML, and up here, we're going to link to a style sheet. So we're going to say, first of all, with the templating engine, load static. This is a prerequisite. And then we can actually link to a style sheet by saying link rel style sheet href is equal to, and now we can use this fancy curly bracket notation again. But in quotation marks, it's going to be static, and then it's going to be in single quotations, css/styles.css. And now what I can do is I can go here, I can create a directory CSS, and I can create inside of that directory a file styles.css. Then I can do something basic like body, and then background, just give it some light blue color, I don't know, RGB. So we're going to go with BB. EEFF or something like this, which is, yeah, pretty. Hey, actually, I have a color picker here. That's kind of cool. Let's go with something more obvious like this. And basically now, if I go to my browser and I reload and I also refresh the cache, you can see that this is applied. So this is how you can include CSS and JavaScript using static files in Django. Now, I would say that these are the basics. I want to show you one or two more things that are a little bit more advanced, not necessarily advanced because only pros use them, but because they go beyond the very basics. One of them is how do you manually adjust migrations? So let's go to the models here. Let's say I do a small change, but a change that Python or Django is not automatically recognizing in the correct way. So for example, let's say I change priority to a different name. I call it importance. And I also change the type of field it is. I change it to a character field, for example, and I change also the choices here, which I'm now going to call not priority choices, but importance choices. These are now going to be text choices. So I'm just going to say low is equal to low, medium is equal to medium, high is equal to high. And the choices now are going to be importance choices dot choices, not priority choices dot choices. So this is a change that's quite simple. It's not very difficult. We know immediately what needs to be done. And of course, I need to also replace this now everywhere I'm using priority. I have to use importance, which I think is primarily here in the form. When I'm using priority, I should be using importance. Then also here in admin PY, importance and importance. So on a code level, we're done with the changes, but now I also want to transition the data in the database. So let me open up the terminal, let me close this, and let's zoom in, let's close this, let's clear, and let's go with a UV run, manage py, make migrations. So what you see is it removed the field priority from to do, and it added a field importance to do. The problem is that this right now, it works. I now have a field importance and I remove the field priority, but the old data is now gone. So the data that I already had in priority was not transferred to importance because Django didn't recognize that this is the same field. I just renamed it. It's a completely new field from Django's perspective. So if I want to adjust this, I can just go to the migrations directory and I can see exactly what the code does and adjust it. So in this case, what are we doing here? We're depending on the previous migration that we already had. So this is clear. We don't need to do anything about this. And then we just remove a field and add a field. What I would like to do instead is I would like to transfer the data. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to define a function up here, which I'm going to call transfer priority to importance, and it's going to take the default parameters that are apps and schema editor. So what we want to do here now is we want to take all the data from priority and we want to convert it to the correct data in importance. So first of all, we need to get the to-do class. I'm going to say to-do is equal to apps.getModel to-dos to-do. So now we can work with the class here without importing it in the conventional way. And now I'm just going to iterate for to-do in to-do objects all. For every single to-do in the database, what I want to do is I want to map the integer values to the text values. So if there is the attribute, if the to-do has the attribute priority, and if the to-do priority is not none, then what I want to do is I want to map it to the correct text value. So for this, I'm going to create a dictionary, quite simple. It's going to be 1, or actually the integer value 1 is going to be mapped to low, 2 is going to be mapped to medium, and 3 is going to be mapped to high. Then, very simple, to do importance, this new field is going to be equal to mapping of the old value to do.priority. Then I'm going to save the to do. That is my operation. Now, of course, this only works if both fields are present. So we need to change the order. First of all, I want to add the new field before I remove the old one. So now I'm going to say add the field, then remove the field, but in between run something for me. And this something is going to be my operation. So I'm going to say migrations.run Python. I'm going to run my function transfer priority to importance. And then we can also define a reverse operation, which is basically if I decide to roll back, what happens. In our case, we could also define the other way around. Okay, take the importance and bring it back to priority. I don't want to do that right now because I don't want to spend all the time. But what you can specify as a placeholder here is just no operation. And that would be migrations run Python .noop, and don't forget the comma. So that is the basic idea here. We just say add the field, transition or transfer all the data, remove the field. We manually adjusted the migration. So now I can go and say uv run manage py migrate. There you go, it worked. The problem, of course, is though I didn't have any data in the database. So right now I'm seeing no importance, but this one didn't actually have a priority as far as I remember. So actually, to see if this works, I want to roll back. I want to demigrate. I want to migrate back to a previous version. And then I want to do the same thing again after I add some data. So how can I do that? I can stop the server and I can say uv run manage py migrate to-dos, and then I can specify this previous migration. So this is the one I depend on. I don't want to have the 0003. I want to roll back to 002. So I can just do that. There you go, rolled back. So if I now go to the admin panel, of course I need to start the server for this. If I go to the admin panel, this produces the problem that I don't have importance because all my code now assumes I have importance, but I don't actually, I have priority still. So I need to go back here. I need to change this back to priority like this, to priority like this, and to priority like this. So now I can go to the admin panel again. I have this one. I can say priority is medium. I can create a new one and I can say here the priority is high. Save this. There you go, high, medium. And now I can go back here. I can close the server and I can migrate to the recent version. I can then run the server again. I can change everything back to what I want with importance here as well. Here as well with the importance choices and everything. Actually didn't do everything. So let me fix this here, importance. And now you can see that I have still high and medium for the importance value because we migrated properly. So now last but not least, I want to show you how we can properly run this with Gunicorn. I'm not going to use a Docker Compose setup, but I'm going to run this with Gunicorn with the professional workers. And we're also going to run a Postgres database with Docker so that we can connect to a different database, not just to the SQLite database. So for running this with Gunicorn, this is actually quite simple. You just install it. So in my case, I'm going to do uv add Gunicorn. In your case, if you're using something else, pip3 install Gunicorn. And then we can just say uv run Gunicorn core.wsgi application like this. And this now runs the application properly. I can click on this. It still works as before. I can also still go to the admin panel and everything. So that is the exact same effect, but now we're no longer running a development server. Second thing, how can we run a Postgres database and connect to it? For this, I'm going to use Docker. You can use any Postgres instance, your local one, your AWS one, wherever you have a Postgres database, you can connect to it. I'm going to use Docker locally. This is actually the wrong pane. I wanted to split this one here. And I'm just going to run this with Docker. So I'm going to say Docker run --name pg-e Postgres _password is equal to Postgres -p 5432 to map the ports, and then -d Postgres to specify the database. Okay, since I already used the same name while preparing this video, I'm going to use something else now. I'm going to go with pgdb as the name. There you go. So now we have a Postgres database running, and in order to connect to it, I'm going to go now, let me just close the split view here. I'm going to go now to settings.py and change my SQLite setup to work with Postgres. So I'm going to say here Django DB backends not SQLite, but Postgres. The name here is going to be Postgres. The user is also going to be Postgres. The password is also going to be Postgres. The host in our case here is going to be localhost, and the port is going to be 5432. That's about it. So now let's go and close this again here and just restart the server. Yeah, this is a fair point. Of course, what we also need to do is we need to install the respective necessary modules. So in my case, let me clear this. It's scopg2. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but basically you say uv add or pip install scopg2, and I go with the binary one just because otherwise I get some installation problems. But then we can just run this. Actually, I have a typo here. It's localhost, not localhost. And now what we need to do is this database doesn't contain anything. So we need to do all the migrations again. Now we don't need to make the migrations. They already exist as files here, but we need to apply them again. So here I'm going to say now uv run manage-py migrate. This is going to migrate everything to the Postgres database. Also, we're going to need to create a super user again because the super user was part of the database. So all the data is gone, of course. And of course, create super user, not creator super user. Root, nothing, root, yes. And now I can say uv run Gunicorn as before. And now we can use the Django admin interface again, root. There you go. We have the same database schema. We have no entries, but everything should work the same as before. So if I go to /todos, I still have the same interface here. I can do everything as before. And that's basically it. Now we're using Postgres and we're running this on a professional server. So that's it for this video today. I hope you enjoyed it and hope you learned something. If so, let me know by hitting a like button and leaving a comment in the comment section down below. Now, of course, we didn't cover every single thing about Django that would be worth covering. This was a crash course. I can also make a detailed course, like my Flask course, for example, that goes like 4 hours where I go into depth on everything. But for this crash course, I wanted to cover a lot of stuff quickly so you know your way around Django on a basic level. If you are interested in a more detailed course, let me know in the comment section down below. Also, if any of you guys are interested in one-on-one tutoring or any services that I can offer, you can find on my website a tutoring tab and a services tab where you can see what I have to offer. You can scroll down and contact me via mail or LinkedIn there. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Besides that, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to not miss a single future video for free. Other than that, thank you much for watching. See you in the next video and bye.